My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to 106.7 Willington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. In recent episodes, we have discussed how, in the current state of emergency, cities and counties around our country have tried to shutter gun stores and ranges, and how the Sheriff of Wake County, Gerald Baker, tried and continues to try to end gun sales using the coronavirus pandemic as rationalization. We discussed how Grassroots North Carolina and the Second Amendment Foundation sued then-Governor Beverly Perdue over what was at the time a blanket ban in North Carolina on carrying firearms and ammunition outside the home during declared states of emergency. We discussed how we got that law struck down on Second Amendment grounds and how we went back and repealed it, meaning that you can now legally carry firearms to protect yourself and your family when you most need to. More recently, we discussed how Sheriff Baker is now under a consent order. We and others sued him to take applications for pistol purchase permits, a consent order which, according to reports starting to come in, he is dragging his feet in complying with. And we discussed how the counties of Wake, Orange, Durham, Guilford, and Mecklenburg, and the cities of Durham and Greensboro have backed off on their attempts to suspend gun sales as, and I quote, non-essential. But unfortunately, it's still getting ugly out there as the implications on civil liberties of the coronavirus emergency continue to be felt, not only in North Carolina but around the country. For example, a burgeoning reopen movement defies social distancing orders to hold public demonstrations. Public redresses of grievances reinforced by the First Amendment, which Raleigh police recently denounced as, quote, non-essential. Businesses have begun defying mandatory closures. Public demonstrations are occurring which here and elsewhere have resulted in arrests. Indeed, in the hotbed of Michigan, armed protesters attempted to enter its legislative chamber. And just Friday, Raleigh joined Michigan with its own armed protesters. In fact, I recently did an interview with an international news service in which I addressed questions concerning the curtailing of civil liberties during the pandemic by saying that paradigms of other countries do not necessarily apply in the U.S. Specifically, I was asked about rumors that the National Guard would be deployed around the country for control of the populace. Those rumors, by the way, widely disseminated by text, which we will discuss later, turned out to be a disinformation campaign. And I pointed out to that interviewer that while I might not completely agree with the armed protesters in Michigan, the demonstration clearly illustrates that the American people, unlike sheep in other countries, will not stand idly by while our civil liberties are curtailed. And the demonstrations illustrate the falsity of the claim that the Second Amendment is outdated and outmoded, showing clearly that arms in the hands of citizens are more important than ever. This will be, and more, will be the topic of today's show. But first, this just in gun rights news. In the old Gun Week magazine, they used to run a regular feature called Only the Cops Should Have Guns, which spoofed a then-popular meme from the left that only the police should possess firearms. Here's one that would qualify. From the Washington Times, report 45 guns lost, stolen from FBI agents over 3 years. FBI agents carelessly left their guns in public bathrooms, hotel rooms, and even a prison, resulting in 45 firearms being lost or stolen over a 3-year period, the Justice Department's Inspector General said Tuesday. In the majority of cases, the weapons were not recovered, and one gun was used in a robbery. The FBI suspended 38 agents for losing their weapons, with the longest penalty running 60 days. Most agents were suspended for about 3 days, although punishments varied. The stolen guns were a mix of firearms, including Glock pistols, other handguns, submachine guns, and carbines. The report noted that the FBI did maintain records, including make, model, and serial number, for only 8 of the 45 lost or stolen weapons, even though policy requires firearms instructors to detail such information. On the legal front, we have good news and bad news. The good news is that a federal judge just threw out California's ammunition background check law, with extreme prejudice, I might note. In the case Rode versus Becerra, U.S. District Court Judge Roger Benitez in San Diego called the regulations, quote, onerous and convoluted, adding that they violate a citizen's Second Amendment rights. Benitez ruled in favor of the California Rifle and Pistol Association, which had filed for a preliminary injunction. In a 120-page opinion, Benitez said, and I quote, the experiment has been tried. The casualties have been counted. California's new ammunition background check law misfires, and the Second Amendment rights of California citizens have been gravely injured. In a rare expression of both truth and common sense, Benitez went on to say, quote, criminals, tyrants, and terrorists don't do background checks. The background check experiment defies common sense while unduly and severely burdening the Second Amendment rights of every responsible gun-owning citizen desiring to lawfully buy ammunition. There were surprising elements of this decision, not the least of which is that Benitez was appointed not by Trump, but by George W. Bush, whose judicial appointments have not been universally successful, say Chief Justice John Roberts. Unsurprisingly, Benitez was born in Cuba. Of all the immigrant groups who have come to America, I have profound respect for those who escaped Fidel Castro and understand the creeping dangers of socialism and its older brother, communism. Now the bad news. You may recall that the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association sued over the New York City law, which prohibited virtually all transport of the few registered guns the city allows, particularly banning transportation outside the city. Immediately after the Supreme Court granted cert to the case, however, the clever lefties of New York, reading the tea leaves, relieved the restriction to minimally allow transportation of guns outside the city in order to moot the case. Unfortunately, in an unsigned opinion, the court agreed with the city, and the suit is now moot for having changed the underlying statute. It's important to note, however, that the court did not rule on the merits of the case, only that it was now moot because the city had changed the law. Justice Samuel Alito, however, wrote a stinging 30-page rebuke of the dismissal. Quote, by incorrectly dismissing this case as moot, the court permits our docket to be manipulated in a way that should not be countenanced. Saying later, the city's travel restriction burdened the very right recognized in Heller. He said, referring to the landmark gun rights case, D.C. versus Heller, history provides no support for a restriction of this type. The city's public safety arguments were weak on their face, were not substantiated in any way, and were accepted below with no serious probing. And once we granted review in this case, the city's public safety concerns evaporated. Alito's dissent was joined in full by Justice Neil Gorsuch and in part by Justice Clarence Thomas. Brett Kavanaugh wrote a separate opinion agreeing with the mootness argument but saying, quote, the court should address a Second Amendment case soon, perhaps in one of the several Second Amendment cases with petitions for certiorari now pending before the court, offering a silver lining for those who have said that even after the Heller and McDonald Supreme Court decisions, lower courts have been treating the Second Amendment as a second-class right. Right now, we're going to take a short break. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After our break, we will return with a discussion of the coronavirus emergency and how you may better defend your rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. First, late-breaking news. Friday night, the Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals did what they typically do. Translated, the most leftist circuit in the nation just reimposed California's ammunition ban, and Benitez's constitutional arguments be damned. According to the NRA, late Friday night, the following order came out from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals granting a temporary stay on the injunction issued on Thursday, April 24th, in the NRA-funded case of Road versus Becerra. This means that the same restrictions that had been previously in effect regarding ammunition in California are back for the time being, pending further order from the court. More on this as it develops. Meanwhile, the global march to end private firearm possession continues in Canada, where leftist Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in the process of exploiting a recent Canadian tragedy in which a licensed gun owner dressed as a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer went on a rampage killing 22 people. Not primarily with a so-called assault weapon, but with a handgun. 9 of the victims reportedly died by fire. But that wasn't stopping Trudeau in following through with the agenda to ban semi-automatic firearms he announced as he campaigned for office. According to the publication The Hill, Canada's government is set to announce a ban on assault-style weapons following a deadly shooting in Nova Scotia this month that killed 22 people. Officials told the Associated Press on Wednesday that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's administration will announce the ban before week's end, though key provisions have already been decided by his cabinet. Among the weapons set to be banned include the AR-15 and Ruger Mini-14. It wasn't initially clear whether Canadian citizens who currently owned such weapons will be required to turn them in. After a deadly shooting in New Zealand, officials banned so-called assault-style weapons and instituted a buyback program. Trudeau's Liberal Party pledged to enact an assault-style weapons ban in last year's election campaign, at the time pledging to implement a similar buyback program. The move comes after a gunman killed 22 people, including a police officer, during a rampage through the rural province of Nova Scotia while driving a car meant to look like an RCMP cruiser. The suspected gunman, 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman, was killed by police. Authorities say Wortman used a number of weapons in the attack and have not released details on them. How curious. However, Wortman was known, and I use that word in quotes, to have been carrying at least 2 semi-automatic rifles, according to the AP. Quote, "I can say that we are on the verge of introducing legislation to ban assault-style weapons across this country," Trudeau said after the shooting. "It was interrupted when the pandemic caused Parliament to be suspended, but we have every intention of moving forward on that measure and potentially other measures when Parliament returns." Traditionally, North Carolina has had an open system of government in which any citizen can go to Raleigh and walk right into the office of his or her state house or Senate representative. The GRNC Legislative Action Team and I have spent many years doing what I used to jokingly call stalking legislators. Unfortunately, that joke, like some of my others, became unfunny when leftists recently began stalking legislators. They called themselves the Moral Monday crowd, and they were anything but. These left-wing, self-professed moralists really just exemplified the temper tantrums we have been accustomed to seeing from the left whenever Republicans win control of anything. In this case, their MO was to show up and crowd the halls of the North Carolina General Assembly, becoming unruly and threatening, and getting themselves arrested. So began the end of open government in North Carolina. The General Assembly installed security checkpoints with metal detectors at doors. Capitol Police began patrolling everywhere. But frankly, as much of a pain as it was to go through the security checkpoints every time we went from one legislative building to another, given the increasingly unhinged left, I couldn't honestly say I blamed them. That would be the legislators. What legislators did last week, however, made security checkpoints pale by comparison. Effectively, they closed you out. Citing the coronavirus pandemic, when the General Assembly returned on April 28th, they completely barred you from entering the legislature, said the Raleigh News and Observer. Quote, "The doors were locked and members of the public weren't allowed inside. Only legislators, staffers, and credentialed members of the news media could come inside." The NNO went on to say, and I quote, "Another change, though, allowed for more public access than ever. The House now live streams its sessions online." Please allow me to call BS. Yes, the legislature should have been live streaming sessions all along, but that does not substitute for the ability of citizens to, quote, "petition the government for a redress of grievances as guaranteed under the First Amendment." Yes, I get it. Legislators are required to conduct business while others can stay safely at home, and nobody wants politicians to get coronavirus. Well, I guess that depends on the politician. But anyway, regardless, it sets a dangerous precedent, a precedent you should object to when speaking to your elected representatives. And when the state reopens the doors of business, the North Carolina legislator had damn well better do the same. Have you ever heard of a psychological phenomenon called projection? Psychological projection is a defense mechanism of the human mind in which one's ego defends itself against unconscious impulses or qualities by denying their existence in themselves, instead attributing them to others. Projection is what gun control advocates are often doing when they say, "You can't be trusted with guns." What they really mean is, they can't be trusted with guns. Take, for example, Ashley Auzen, the Texas mother who was a vocal advocate for stricter gun control, and who killed herself and her 3 children just a few months ago. In fact, many, if not most, of the mass killers in recent memory were committed by leftists. A recent example was the massacre last year in Christchurch, New Zealand, in which the killer went on a rampage precisely to foment support for gun bans. What we have seen repeatedly on the part of the left is childish impulsivity, which they unconsciously realize they have, but rather than admitting it to themselves, attribute to you. If you go to GRNC's YouTube channel, you can still find a clip from the Great Gun Debate, a televised debate I did several years ago. In it, you will hear one of the pro-gun panelists make the point that guns in the hands of the law-abiding are not the problem. What you hear next from Gail Neely, then director of North Carolinians Against Gun Violence, pretty much says it all. Neely bleats like a sheep, interjecting, "They're law-abiding till they're not." In Gail's mind, and in the minds of all like her, lies the unstated implication that since she can't be trusted with guns, nobody else can either, and that therefore all of this nonsense about reasonable gun laws is just that, nonsense. Because if nobody can be trusted with any type of firearm, the logical outcome is the complete confiscation of firearms. Well, add another data point because it just happened again. In case you don't remember Florida's last gubernatorial election, Tallahassee mayor and Democrat nominee for governor of Florida, Andrew Gillum, threatened at the time on Twitter, quote, "When we win, we are going to ban assault weapons in Florida." Worse, at that point in time, Gillum was leading in the polls. Well, that was 2018. Now let's cut to 2020. Writing in the excellent gun-related news source AmmoLand.com, writer David Codrea recently published an article entitled "Gillum Actions Give Insights into Man Who Would Disarm Us." Quote, "Police photos from scene of overdose incident involving Florida Democrat Andrew Gillum reveal crystal meth and erectile dysfunction drugs." Oh well. The Washington Beacon reported Thursday. Police were called in the early hours of March 13 by one of the men who told police he arrived in the room to find Gillum vomiting in the bathroom and a second person non-responsive on the bed. Writes Codrea, naturally he was not arrested. From the looks of reports, police let him go home without incident, meaning they are aware who Gillum was and behaved themselves accordingly. This was the man who was almost elected governor of Florida, the chief executive responsible for ensuring laws were upheld. Had he been elected, he'd be working to criminalize the rights of citizens who aren't caught vomiting in hotel rooms with drugs. As always, when a leftist says you can't be trusted with guns, what they really mean is they can't be trusted with guns. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with more critical information and enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. I don't know about you, but in recent weeks I've heard all manner of rumors regarding stay-at-home orders and declarations of states of emergency. Maybe you even got the following text message, which was forwarded from elsewhere, of course. Quote, "Here's what my friend texted me. Dad works for Homeland Security. He said they are preparing to mobilize the National Guard, preparing to dispatch them across the U.S. along with military. Next, they will call in first responders. He said they are preparing to announce a nationwide one-week quarantine for all citizens, all businesses closed, everyone at home. They were told to pack and be prepared for up to 30 days deployment, which he said means they may extend the quarantine for up to 30 days. He told me to notify our family members and have them stocked up and be prepared. They will announce this as soon as they have troops in place to prevent looters and rioters. He said he got the call last night and was told to pack and be prepared for the call today with his dispatch orders. He thinks they will announce before the end of the weekend to keep people home on Monday." Closer to home, I even had one former legislator tell me he had heard that on Monday morning, Governor Cooper would be expanding his declaration to ban the sale of all gardening supplies, similar to the draconian and politically biased restrictions imposed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. God knows I've had enough people forwarding me their dark conspiracy of the day, from forced vaccinations to supposed 50% gun taxes being hidden in federal coronavirus assistance, to the pandemic being a false front for a police state, to this little gem, quote, "For now, the public is being convinced to assume that lockdowns and restrictions are temporary, but this is a lie. The elites must maintain and increase restrictions with each passing month in order to prevent rebellion until they are ready to implement martial law. A new process of mass conditioning is about to be set in motion, using waves of panic and then waves of release and calm." The elites. Mass conditioning. Martial law. Given the rumors flying right now, let's take a look at what has not happened. Nobody has declared martial law, nor likely could they. And by the way, that text was the apparent result of the Chinese. The Epoch Times, a freedom oriented newspaper published, ironically or not, by refugees from the People's Republic of China, of which the paper is quite critical, did an excellent piece entitled COVID-19 Emergency Powers Leave Freedom in Temporary Short Supply. And I quote, "One of the hallmarks of the United States is that it is a federation, so powers are divided between the central government and the state governments," said Professor Robert Natelson, an expert on constitutional law and head of the Constitutional Studies Center. "The federal government has no general police power outside of the federal territories and federal enclaves like D.C., he told the Epoch Times. "The reason that's important is that police power generally includes the power to respond to emergencies like quarantines, travel restrictions, business restrictions by lockdowns." The piece goes on to quote Charles Stimson, a national security expert and senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Discussing the possibility of martial law, quote, "I do not envision that happening," said Stimson, suggesting that it would take a dystopian nightmare with millions of people acting in all sorts of horrible ways for the president to enact it. "Martial law is a term that's not really well understood," he said. "Martial law is rarely, if ever, invoked. It hasn't been invoked in modern times in the United States. It allows either the state governor or the president to treat anybody who is in violation of his orders as if they are in the military, as if they are in violation of a military order, and to court-martial him." Natelson said that martial law can result from legislation passed in a state or federal legislature, or from a declaration by president or governor within an, quote, "actual field of hostilities." Obviously, he said, there are no hostilities in the United States. "I think it would be very difficult, certainly open to challenge, for a president or governor to declare martial law in the absence of legislation authorizing it." Further, nobody has deployed the National Guard for enforcement purposes. Indeed, reports suggest that the text I quoted above may have been the work of the Chinese seeking to further exploit the pandemic they created. In fact, I recently did the interview I mentioned earlier with the international media organ, in which I struggled to make the interviewer, who was from a country with a very different understanding of governmental powers, I tried to make him understand why that could not happen here. That includes the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which, unlike the countries you see deploying the military to keep order during the current emergency, generally prohibits the military from being used for domestic law enforcement. Yes, the act specifically applies only to the U.S. Army and, as amended in 1956, the U.S. Air Force. Although it does not specifically mention the U.S. Navy, the Department of Navy has prescribed regulations that are generally construed to give the act force there as well. No, it does not specifically apply to the National Guard when deployed for law enforcement purposes by the governor of the state which controls that guard unit. Which brings up the next point. The National Guard is generally not national at all, but is by default under the command of the individual states unless federalized, in which case it likely could not be used for domestic law enforcement. In fact, the president really can't do much, as evidenced by Trump backing off his claim that he was the one responsible for reopening businesses in the states. Said the Epoch Times, quote, "Professor Lawrence Gostin, who directs the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, made the following point to C-SPAN. We often think the president is all-powerful, and it is true that with international travel bans he has extraordinarily broad powers. But within the country, it is the states, the cities, and the localities that have the primary, what we call police power. In sum, short of martial law, which is extremely unlikely, the powers of the federal government to impose restrictions on civil liberties are actually quite limited. And the federal guidelines issued in March and cited in most state and local declarations are, in fact, just that, recommendations, not mandatory restrictions. All of this, however, does not imply that our civil liberties are not under assault, and I most certainly do not mean to imply that some governmental authorities have not usurped, means stolen, powers to which they are not entitled. That was produce some very real restrictions on your freedoms. A surfer in California was recently fined $1,000. In Michigan, petty dictator Governor Gretchen Whitmer enacted a ban on selling seeds, soil, and plants. She also made a leftist determination that you may use a kayak or a canoe, but you may not use a powerboat. A Louisiana pastor was arrested for holding church services. Like a dystopian science fiction movie, a New Jersey town, yes, New Jersey, which I'm sure surprises none of you, is using talking drones to warn people about social distancing. Yes, sir, Elizabeth, New Jersey, has drones swarming above people's heads and commanding stop gathering. Summonses have and will continue to be issued for those found in violation. Fines are up to $1,000. You have been advised. We should note here that Elizabeth has emulated the Chinese in using drones for intimidation. Right here in Raleigh, protesters are being arrested for violating social distancing regulations. The first protest in Raleigh was organized by Reopen NC, a private Facebook group that wants people to make their own stay-at-home decisions. At the protest held on April 14th, a woman was arrested and charged with violating Governor Roy Cooper's stay-at-home order. At roughly 12:30 p.m., according to the N&O, police demanded protesters disperse, announcing, "You are in violation of the executive order. You are posing a risk to public health. If you do not disperse, you will be taken and processed at Wake County Jail." And in the end, a well-dressed, middle-class woman left in handcuffs. Perhaps the most telling was a tweet from the Raleigh Police Department in response to a demonstrator who asked why the arrests were taking place. With a complete lack of irony or awareness of the First Amendment, the RPD responded, and I quote, "Protesting is a non-essential activity." Fortunately, the protesters didn't agree because the next week, on April 21st, they turned out 1,000 strong. To give you a flavor of who opposes restrictions and who doesn't, this from the N&O. Although some organizers have said the protest was bipartisan, a majority of those at the rally seemed to support conservative Republicans. Democrats were quick to condemn the protest as dangerous. "We must let science, facts, and data guide our steps," Democrat Party Chairman Wayne Goodwin said in a news release. "Protesting safely under these circumstances is one thing, but today's demonstration quickly devolved into a dangerous situation." What's worse, a number of Republicans flagrantly encouraged this behavior, which endangered our heroes on the front lines. Here you go. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. After the break, we will return with more information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. Today on Wilmington's Big Talker, our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In the last segment, we looked at some of the draconian restrictions being adopted for the coronavirus emergency, not so much by the federal government, but by state and local governments, which are, as I have often said, channeling their inner dictator. Take, for example, a piece by Reformation Charlotte, a faith-based online source, called, quote, "It's okay to gather for a drive-in non-essential gathering so long as it isn't in a church parking lot." The piece recounts, and I quote, "We hear case after case where churches hold gatherings, some of them drive-in gatherings, to worship and listen to the pastor preach, only to find themselves harassed by police. In most states, the church has not been deemed essential enough to warrant constitutional protection. Noting exceptions for some groups have been given, it goes on to say, let's get this straight. It's okay to gather for a non-essential drive-in gathering so long as it isn't in a church parking lot." And, as a result, it's getting ugly out there. As we noted earlier, the first reported armed protest occurred in Michigan, where hundreds of protesters, some armed, attempted to enter the legislative chamber of Michigan's state capital. Closer to home, in downtown Raleigh, Friday afternoon, demonstrators, some carrying guns, marched in downtown Raleigh to protest coronavirus restrictions and the statewide stay-at-home order. Now, what about the constitutionality of this shutdown? Noting that many of the restrictions being imposed on Americans are contrary to the Constitution, Fox News' Andrew Napolitano said that governors can't pass laws, only legislatures can do so. True enough. But that argument misses the fact that in virtually every state, legislatures have already given governors and local governments expanded powers within a state's state of emergency laws. In truth, to this layman, and I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV, I suspect the answer is it depends. It depends on what the legislature of a given state has passed, and it depends on whether the expanded powers passed by the legislature fall within the purview of the Constitution, as we demonstrated in 2012 when we sued Governor Perdue and struck down the state of emergency gun ban. With respect to the arrest in Raleigh mentioned in our last segment, police do have the power to use criminal charges to enforce Cooper's stay-at-home order, at least according to Shay Denning, a criminal law expert at the UNC School of Government. And in an officially declared emergency, there is precedent for the government being able to take actions to address the emergency that might in normal times infringe on people's rights. But Napolitano is correct in saying that in many places, coronavirus enforcement is becoming increasingly Orwellian. The surfer we talked about banned $1,000. The banning of sales of soil and seeds in Michigan. The arrest of the Louisiana pastor for holding church services. Protesters being arrested here in Raleigh because protest is a non-essential activity. And, of course, the dystopian use of drones in the New Jersey town, kind of like China, to tell people stop gathering. Summonses have and will continue to be issued. You have been advised. And by the way, while we're at it, let's put to rest a popular myth being said on the media that the authoritarian tendencies being displayed are equally distributed between both parties as bipartisan. By and large, bureaucrats who have been channeling their inner dictator have been from the left. Obviously, nothing is good about 1 million Americans getting a communicable disease, or worse, 63,000 of them dying from it. But there are lessons we can learn. For starters, that conservatives have been duped by globalists under the banner of free trade into doing things which are contrary to national security. Farming out things like drug manufacture and even, as proposed during the Clinton administration, the manufacture of military ammunition to China. Yes, that was really proposed. It has raised public awareness by people previously oblivious that civil liberties as we know them are not a given. And it has underscored that the right to keep and bear arms, as reinforced by the Second Amendment, remains as relevant today as it was in 1791. More importantly, the theft of your freedoms most likely comes not from the federal government, but instead by state governments. So what have you done recently to keep your state and local governments honest? Do you research and vote for state and local offices, or just the president every 4 years? Do you keep track of state legislation, or do you just pontificate about the latest gun control in Congress? Can you even name your state legislators, much less have their contact information? But perhaps, most importantly, some, or at least a number of Americans are learning not to just accept any old tyrannical governmental directive without questioning it. I've read quotes from business owners who thought long and hard about joining protests calling for reopening our economy, who actually didn't want to protest, but ultimately did because they learned to question governmental edicts. Or the many businesses refusing to comply with shutdown orders, including a restaurant that's taking action after getting its business license and liquor license revoked for noncompliance. Yes, I've heard the complaint that many members of our society are behaving like sheeple. They are opting for safety at the cost of governmental intrusion on their lives and freedoms. But on the other side, we have a public dialogue taking place right now about what the government can and cannot do in restricting individual liberties. Now understand that I'm not saying I agree with the protests. As one who has over the years organized a number of highly publicized protests, I regard the Reopen movement as poorly organized, often muddled with an unsaleable message, particularly when somebody not clearly skilled or prepared enough to speak to the media makes everybody look like idiots. And armed protests might at some point be called for, but probably not now. Right now, bringing an AR-15 to a public protest, in addition to being against the law, conveys the message to moderates that only nutcases publicly oppose governmental restrictions. But overall, the direct impact of lifestyle restrictions on the American public has caused tens of thousands to question why, and more importantly, how the government can do that. That's a message I tried to give the international media, that the paradigm of having the National Guard or military dominate the American public is not only against our republic and our Constitution and Bill of Rights, it is something the American people will not accept. Maybe armed protesters gaining access to the Michigan legislature doesn't paint a pretty picture. Maybe they aren't being, by most people's standards, reasonable. But what they are doing is depicting a loud and clear message to every politician that there are limits to what the American people will accept. And however poor the messaging of those armed protesters, their display of resolution is a good thing. Even more illustrative than the recent international interview I mentioned was one I did back in 2013 when Congress was debating federal gun control. I got a call from the head of a New York bureau of a major Japanese newspaper who asked whether he could fly to North Carolina to interview me on why we oppose so-called universal background checks and why we oppose bans on semi-automatic firearms. We did an interview one Sunday evening while sitting at my dining room table, and I was struck by two things. He asked to see an AR-15. Now, I normally don't display firearms in media interviews, but knowing he likely didn't understand from a personal perspective what we were talking about, I got an AR-15 out of the safe to show him. The first thing that struck me was that when I placed the unloaded gun on the table, it was as though I had placed a live cobra on the table. He actually backed away as though it would come off the table and attack him. But the more profound realization came in trying to explain to him the intent of the framers in drafting the Second Amendment to be the last in a long series of checks and balances against the abuse of government. Here it is, folks. Despite what I regard as fairly good communication skills, to this educated Japanese gentleman, no matter how many times I tried, no matter how I phrased it, no matter how many examples I gave, he was culturally incapable of understanding that in the American form of government, we, the people, are the masters, and the government is our servant. Nothing in his education, his upbringing, and his culture prepared him to understand that. We are not servants of the government. And that is what I hope the debate spurred by the coronavirus emergency shutdown and the resulting reopen movement will do. To what our schools, controlled by leftists, have refused to do, to deliver the message to tens of thousands of Americans that they are the master and government is their servant. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check out my site, GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, where you can find previous editions of this show and my writings, GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com. See you next Sunday at 5.